Here's a number that should stop you cold. In 2014, India's GDP stood at $2 trillion. Today, in 2026, it has crossed $4.3 trillion. That is a doubling of economic output in just over a decade. But here's what the mainstream media is not telling you. The IMF has now formally projected that India will become the world's third largest economy by 2027, overtaking Japan and Germany simultaneously. Not sequentially, simultaneously. And in Washington, Beijing, Brussels, and Riyadh, behind closed doors, in rooms that don't appear on any camera feed, strategists are asking one question above all others. What leverage do we actually have left over New Delhi? The answer increasingly is very little. Welcome to the Strategic Intelligence Report. I'm your host, and today we are unpacking the most consequential geopolitical realignment of the 21st century. Let us begin with context. Because to understand what is happening right now, you have to understand the architecture of the world that came before. For the better part of 7 decades, the global order operated on a specific framework. America provided the security umbrella, the dollar provided the monetary infrastructure, and multilateral institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, provided the rules of engagement. Every major economy plugged into this system, and for a long time, it worked. But here is where the structural fault lines began to appear. By the mid-2010s, American foreign policy became increasingly transactional and inconsistent. Sanctions were weaponized, dollar dominance was used as a geopolitical cudgel, supply chains were treated as extensions of diplomatic pressure, and the world took note. China had already begun building alternative architecture, the Belt and Road, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the digital yuan, but China came with strings. China came with debt traps. China came with political conditions that many nations in the global south found just as suffocating as the old Western order. And into that vacuum stepped India, not aggressively, not with tanks or trade ultimatums, but with something far more powerful in the long run, structural credibility. India offered a democratic governance model, a rule of law tradition, a rapidly modernizing technological base, and, critically, a stated foreign policy doctrine of strategic autonomy that told the world, we will not be anyone's subordinate. That doctrine, first articulated explicitly under the Modi government, has now become the defining foreign policy posture of the world's most populous nation, and in 2026 its consequences are reverberating from Capitol Hill to the corridors of the European Commission. To understand why 2026 is a turning point, and not just another data point in India's growth story, we have to look at the specific structural leverage that New Delhi has quietly accumulated. Because this isn't just a trend, this is a permanent shift in the global order. Let us talk about leverage. In geopolitics, leverage is not just military power. True, durable leverage comes from 3 sources: economic indispensability, technological irreplaceability, and demographic compulsion. India, in 2026, commands all 3. Let us break them down. First, economic indispensability. India is now the fastest-growing major economy on Earth, projected by the IMF to sustain GDP growth rates between 6.5% and 7.2% annually through the end of the decade. To put that in perspective, the United States is growing at approximately 2.1%, the Eurozone at 1.4%, Japan at under 1%. When your economy is growing 3 to 4 times faster than the economies of the world's legacy powers, the direction of capital flows is not a matter of debate. Capital moves toward growth. It always has. It always will. And capital is moving to India at a scale that is structurally unprecedented. Foreign direct investment into India crossed $85 billion in the last fiscal year. Apple, Samsung, Foxconn, and over 60 Fortune 500 companies have now established or significantly expanded manufacturing operations on Indian soil. This is not a coincidence. This is strategic recalibration by global corporations who understand that the China Plus One strategy is now the China Minus One strategy for many of them. Second, technological irreplaceability. India currently produces 1.5 million STEM graduates per year. The United States produces approximately 300,000. The talent pipeline is not even close, and it is not just raw numbers. India's digital public infrastructure, the UPI payment system, the Aadhaar biometric identity framework, the ONDC Open Commerce Network, These are not just domestic tools, they are exportable models of sovereign digital infrastructure that developing nations across Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America are now actively adopting. India is not just growing internally. India is exporting the architecture of its economic miracle to a global audience that is hungry for alternatives to both Western conditionality and Chinese debt dependency. Third, demographic compulsion. India has 1.44 billion people. The median age is 28 years old. Compare that to China, median age 39 and rising rapidly. Germany, median age 46. Japan, median age 49. The demographic dividend that India is sitting on is not just an economic statistic, it is a multi-decade structural advantage that no policy intervention by any rival power can neutralize. You cannot manufacture young people on short notice. You cannot import a workforce culture overnight. India's demographic architecture gives it a runway of sustained productivity that no other major economy can match. And the IMF's own long-range modeling has acknowledged this explicitly. Before we go further, if you value data-driven analysis over mainstream narratives designed to keep you reactive rather than strategic, I want to invite you to join our community of strategic thinkers. Hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, because the analysis we do here, sourced from IMF data, World Bank projections, and verified geopolitical intelligence, is designed to keep you ahead of the shift. Not just informed, ahead. Subscribe now, and let's continue. Now let us talk about the United States, because here is where the narrative becomes genuinely fascinating. America is not declining in the way that declinist commentators have been predicting since the 1970s. The United States military remains the most technologically advanced in human history. The dollar remains the world's primary reserve currency. American innovation, Silicon Valley, biotech, defense technology remains world-class. But here is what is happening. America is experiencing what strategists call institutional paralysis on the foreign policy front, a condition where the machinery of global leadership outpaces the domestic political consensus needed to sustain it. Washington cannot agree on trade policy. It cannot agree on immigration, which directly affects its ability to absorb global talent. It has cycled through dramatically opposing foreign policy doctrines in consecutive administrations, and the world, including India, has been watching. Strategic partners do not want unpredictability. They want structural reliability. And so what you are seeing, quietly, without dramatic announcements, is a fundamental rebalancing of the Indo-American relationship. It is no longer a relationship where Washington sets the terms and New Delhi adapts. It is increasingly a relationship of strategic codependency. And here is the evidence. In 2023, the ICET framework, the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies, was formally launched between India and the United States. This was not a minor diplomatic courtesy. This was Washington formally acknowledging that India's technological capacity in semiconductors, in space, in AI, in defense manufacturing is indispensable to American strategic interests. The United States is investing in India's defense industrial base not out of generosity. It is doing so because the math of maintaining global technological supremacy requires Indian partnership. General Electric's F414 jet engine technology transfer to India, a deal of extraordinary strategic sensitivity, was approved. That is not the action of a superpower dealing with a subordinate client state. That is the action of a superpower dealing with a structural equal whose cooperation it genuinely needs. And Prime Minister Modi has navigated this transition with what can only be described as masterclass level diplomatic precision. He has not been anti-American. He has not been pro-Chinese. He has not been captured by either pole of a bipolar world that is rapidly ceasing to be bipolar. He has been consistently, deliberately, and profoundly effectively pro-Indian. And in doing so, he has made India the most strategically valuable swing state in the entire global order. Now here is where this analysis gets truly consequential. Because what Modi's strategic doctrine has done is not just position India favorably, it has fundamentally altered the cost-benefit calculation that Washington makes every single time it contemplates a major foreign policy move. To understand why that is a permanent structural shift, let us look at the specific mechanisms through which New Delhi now exerts leverage over global outcomes. There are 4 specific mechanisms through which India is reshaping American global power dynamics in 2026. I want to walk through each one methodically, because this is where the analysis moves beyond headlines and into structural reality. Mechanism 1, the Russia-Ukraine energy equation. When Western powers imposed sweeping sanctions on Russian energy following the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, India did not comply. India continued purchasing Russian crude oil at discounted rates. Not because New Delhi supports Russian aggression, India has consistently called for dialogue and cessation of hostilities in UN forums, but because India operates under a doctrine of strategic autonomy, the principle that Indian national interest, particularly the energy security of 1.44 billion people, cannot be subordinated to the foreign policy preferences of external powers. And what was the result? India became one of the world's largest refiners of Russian crude, and then re-exported refined petroleum products to European markets that were simultaneously sanctioning Russia. Europe, effectively, was buying Russian energy through Indian intermediation. Washington understood this. Washington chose to look the other way, because the alternative, genuinely sanctioning India or issuing ultimatums, was geopolitically unthinkable given the strategic importance of the relationship. That is leverage. Not leverage through threats or military posturing. Leverage through economic structural positioning that created mutual dependency. Mechanism 2. The Quad and India's irreplaceable role. The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, America, Japan, Australia, India, is the primary multilateral vehicle through which the United States is attempting to manage Chinese strategic expansion in the Indo-Pacific. And here is the structural reality that Washington lives with every single day. Without India, there is no Quad. Without India's geography, which literally straddles the Indian Ocean, the gateway between the Pacific and the Middle East, the entire Indo-Pacific strategic architecture collapses. India's navy controls sea lanes through which 80% of global oil trade passes. India's airspace and military basing potential are irreplaceable in any serious conflict scenario involving the Indo-Pacific theater. Washington needs India's participation in the Quad far more than India needs Washington's validation of its global status. And Modi has extracted extraordinary value from that asymmetric dependency, in technology transfers, in defense co-production agreements, in diplomatic backing on issues ranging from UNSC permanent membership advocacy to multilateral trade forum positioning. Mechanism 3. The Global South Leadership Pivot. During India's G20 presidency in 2023, New Delhi achieved something that was considered diplomatically impossible. It secured a consensus declaration from all G20 members, including Russia and China, on issues of global debt restructuring, climate finance, and development. That accomplishment sent a message to the entire Global South and to Washington that India possesses a unique capacity to act as a diplomatic bridge between the world's competing power blocs. The African Union's formal admission to the G20, championed by India, was not a ceremonial gesture. It was a strategic consolidation of India's leadership credentials among the 55-nation African bloc, the continent that will be the world's largest population center and one of its fastest-growing economic zones by 2050. Washington does not have that relationship. Beijing has attempted to build it but has generated significant backlash over predatory lending. India's relationship with the Global South is built on peer solidarity, the world's largest developing democracy leading by example rather than by condescension. That is a form of soft power that cannot be purchased. It can only be earned, and India has been earning it systematically for years. Mechanism 4. The Semiconductor and Technology Supply Chain. The United States CHIPS Act, the $52 billion legislative investment in domestic semiconductor manufacturing, was predicated on a recognition that American technological supremacy had become dangerously overdependent on geographically concentrated supply chains. India's role in the new semiconductor architecture is not peripheral, it is central. Micron Technology has committed to a $2.75 billion semiconductor packaging facility in Gujarat. Applied Materials, Lam Research, and AMAT have all announced significant Indian investments. And India's own Semicon India program, with $10 billion in targeted incentives, is designed to position the country not merely as an assembly location, but as a full-spectrum semiconductor ecosystem player within this decade. The second-order effect of this: every American semiconductor company that deepens its Indian operational footprint becomes a domestic lobbying force for strong Indo-American relations within the United States political system. India is not just attracting investment. India is creating structural constituencies within American corporate and political culture that will defend the bilateral relationship for decades to come. That is not economics. That is macro-strategic architecture. What we have just described are not isolated policy wins. They are interlocking mechanisms of a coherent strategic doctrine, and when you see them in totality, you begin to understand why this is not a trend that can be reversed by the next election cycle in Washington or a slowdown in one quarter's growth data. This is structural, this is permanent, and the implications for the global macroeconomy are only beginning to materialize. Let us spend some time in the data, because the philosophical and geopolitical arguments are compelling, but numbers do not negotiate. Here's the macroeconomic landscape as of 2026. India's GDP at purchasing power parity, the most accurate measure of real economic weight, already makes it the world's third largest economy, behind only the United States and China, surpassing Germany and Japan. India's manufacturing sector, supercharged by the production-linked incentive scheme across 14 strategic sectors, is growing at double-digit rates. Electronics exports from India have crossed $35 billion annually and are projected to reach $120 billion by 2030, a trajectory that would make India one of the world's top 5 electronics exporters. The UPI payment system, India's indigenous digital payments infrastructure, processes more real-time transactions monthly than the entire real-time payment volumes of Europe, the United States, and the United Kingdom combined. That is not a statistic to footnote. That is a civilizational data point. It tells you that India has built, at scale, a digital economic nervous system that outperforms the financial infrastructure of the world's most advanced economies, and that system is now being exported. Singapore, UAE, France, Sri Lanka, Mauritius, Nepal, Bhutan, Bahrain all have live UPI linkages. The digital public infrastructure model, including Aadhaar, UPI, DigiLocker, and ONDC, has been formally endorsed by the G20 and the World Bank as a global development template. India is not just a growth story. India is becoming the operating system of the next generation of emerging market economies. Now let us look at the capital markets dimension. India's stock market capitalization crossed $5 trillion in 2024, making it the fourth largest equity market in the world. Global index providers MSCI, FTSE Russell, Bloomberg have been systematically increasing India's weighting in their emerging market indices. JP Morgan's inclusion of Indian government bonds in its Global Emerging Market Bond Index, effective from 2024, triggered an estimated $40 billion in passive capital inflows from global institutional investors. Now let us address the counterpoint that sophisticated viewers will already be forming. What about China? What about the European Union? Are they not formidable rivals to this thesis? It is a fair question, and the answer reveals something even more important. China's structural deceleration. China's growth model, built on export-led manufacturing, state-directed investment, and demographic expansion, is facing simultaneous structural headwinds that are not cyclical. They are architectural. The property sector crisis, with Evergrande and Country Garden representing the visible tip of a $10+ trillion debt iceberg, has consumed approximately 25–30% of Chinese GDP in embedded risk. China's youth unemployment rate hit above 20% in 2023 before the government stopped publishing the data publicly. China's working-age population peaked in 2011 and has been declining since. And the geopolitical premium, the additional risk that global investors and corporations price into Chinese operations due to regulatory unpredictability, US-China decoupling pressure, and Taiwan scenario risk, is structurally embedded into every capital allocation decision. The China Plus One strategy of global supply chain diversification has, in many sectors, evolved into a China Minus One strategy, and the primary beneficiary of that capital and manufacturing exodus is, overwhelmingly, India. Not Vietnam, not Mexico, not Indonesia, though all are growing. India, because only India has the scale, the skill base, and the institutional infrastructure to absorb large-scale industrial relocation at the pace that global corporations require. Now, the European Union. Europe's challenges are profound and, at their root, self-authored. The energy crisis triggered by overdependency on Russian gas, a dependency that was maintained despite years of American strategic warnings, has permanently raised European industrial energy costs. Germany, the engine of European economic growth, is in a structural recession. Its industrial model, built on cheap Russian energy and open access to Chinese markets, has lost both pillars simultaneously. And the political fractures within the European Union, between Eastern and Western members on migration, rule of law, and defense spending, represent institutional paralysis at the governance level that makes decisive strategic responses extraordinarily difficult. Europe is not collapsing, but Europe is losing altitude relative to the rising powers, and has no clear structural pathway to recovery that does not involve either painful domestic reform or deeper strategic partnership with nations like India. And that partnership, increasingly important to the EU as it diversifies away from China, further enhances India's negotiating leverage in every multilateral forum where European support matters. We have now established the macroeconomic foundation, the geopolitical mechanisms, and the structural decline of rival power models. But here is the question that separates strategic thinkers from passive observers. What are the second-order effects? What does a world where India is a genuine co-equal of American global power actually look like? And what does it mean for you, for capital allocation, and for the businesses and careers of the next generation? That is what the final segment of this report is dedicated to. Second-order effects are where strategic intelligence separates itself from mere reporting. Anyone can read the GDP numbers. The question is, what do those numbers cause to happen next? Let me walk you through 4 second-order effects that are already materializing and will compound dramatically over the next decade. Second-order effect 1, the rupee's expanding role. India is actively pursuing bilateral trade settlement in Indian rupees with an expanding list of partner nations: Russia, the UAE, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and multiple African nations. This is not yet a challenge to dollar hegemony in the macro sense, but it is the laying of institutional infrastructure for a world where a larger share of global trade is settled outside the dollar system. The IMF has explicitly discussed SDR basket reweighting scenarios that would eventually include the rupee. Every percentage point of global trade that shifts to rupee settlement is a percentage point of reduced structural demand for dollars, and a corresponding increase in India's monetary sovereignty and geopolitical room to maneuver. Second-order effect 2, the global talent realignment. India's diaspora, 32 million strong, the world's largest, occupies commanding positions in the technology, finance, academic, and political institutions of every major Western democracy. The CEOs of Google, Microsoft, IBM, Adobe, FedEx, multiple Fortune 500 companies simultaneously, are of Indian origin. The Vice President of the United States was of Indian origin. The Chancellor of the United Kingdom was of Indian origin. This is not coincidence. This is the human capital dividend of decades of STEM-focused education and diaspora entrepreneurship. And here is the second-order effect that most analysts miss. This diaspora increasingly serves as an informal diplomatic nervous system, creating cultural, commercial, and political linkages between India and the world's power centers that no formal treaty could replicate. Second-order effect. 3. The defense industrial revolution. India's defense exports stood at approximately $200 million in 2016. By 2025, they had crossed $2.6 billion, a more than 12-fold increase in under a decade. The target set by the government is $5 billion by 2025 and $10 billion by 2029. India is now exporting defense equipment to over 85 countries. The BrahMos supersonic cruise missile, co-developed with Russia, has generated extraordinary export interest from Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, and multiple Middle Eastern nations. When India becomes a major defense exporter, it builds strategic relationships, creates technological codependencies, and gains leverage in international forums that transcends pure economics. Defense exports are not just revenue, they are strategic anchors, creating long-term relationships that shape voting patterns in multilateral organizations, intelligence sharing arrangements, and diplomatic solidarity in moments of crisis. Second-order effect 4. The climate finance architecture. India has committed to reaching net zero by 2070, a timeline that is later than Western targets, but that, for an economy still delivering hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, is entirely defensible on equity grounds. And in the interim, India is pursuing the world's most ambitious renewable energy expansion, 500 gigawatts of renewable capacity by 2030. That investment in solar, in wind, in green hydrogen is not just an environmental commitment, it is a macroeconomic transformation of the energy sector that will reduce India's import bill, strengthen the rupee, and position Indian companies as global leaders in clean energy technology and manufacturing. And in every international climate negotiation, India's voice, as the world's most populous nation, a major emitter, and the leader of the global south, carries structurally decisive weight. The West cannot achieve its climate goals without India's cooperation, and India has made clear that its cooperation comes with terms involving technology transfer, climate finance, and recognition of the development equity arguments that the Global South has been making for decades. We have covered a great deal of ground in this report, and I want to close with the most important analytical point of all. This is not reversible. The rise of India as a co-equal pillar of global power is not contingent on any single election outcome, in India, in America, or anywhere else. It is not contingent on any single policy decision. It is structurally driven by forces that operate on timescales measured in decades, not election cycles. Demography cannot be reversed quickly. Capital infrastructure once built does not disappear. Technological capability once developed does not evaporate. Institutional credibility once earned is extraordinarily durable. India has been building all four of these pillars systematically, deliberately, and increasingly effectively for the better part of 3 decades. The reforms of the 1991 liberalization created the foundation. The demographic dividend of the 1990s and 2000s created the human capital. The IT revolution of the 2000s and 2010s created the technological credibility, and the structural governance reforms of the 2010s and 2020s, GST implementation, IBC insolvency reform, digital public infrastructure, PLI manufacturing incentives, have created the institutional architecture for sustained macroeconomic dominance. None of this is an accident. None of this is luck. This is the result of deliberate civilizational strategy, pursued by successive Indian governments, sustained by Indian civil society, and powered by the extraordinary energy and ambition of 1.44 billion people who have decided collectively that their moment has arrived. And on the global stage, in Washington, in Brussels, in Beijing, in Riyadh, that realization is settling in with the weight of irreversibility. The endgame has not just begun. The endgame is already underway. And the nations, the corporations, the investors, and the individuals who recognize this and position themselves accordingly will be the ones who look back on this moment and say, "We saw it, we understood it, we acted." Before I leave you today, I want to pose the question that every strategic thinker watching this report must now wrestle with. The global economy is reorienting toward India. Capital is moving. Supply chains are moving. Diplomatic weight is shifting. The macro data is not ambiguous. The structural forces are not reversible. So here is the strategic question. How are you positioning yourself, your career, your investments, your business, your thinking, for a world in which India is not an emerging market, but a defining pillar of the global order? That question does not have a comfortable passive answer. It demands strategic intentionality. And if you want that roadmap, the specific framework for understanding India's financial dominance architecture, what sectors will lead, which markets will benefit, and how the capital flows of the next decade will be structured around this realignment, that is exactly what our next report covers. The link is above. The analysis is waiting. Stay strategic, stay ahead of the shift, and I will see you in the war room.